The NFL draft has come and gone, and it's time to recap and grade another division in the NFL. Tonight, we're going to do the AFC North on the Draft Beard podcast. Welcome in tonight to the Draft Beard podcast. I am your host, Joshua Klein. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. So tonight, we are going to recap and give some draft grades on the drafts of the Cleveland Browns, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Baltimore Ravens. So we're doing the AFC North tonight. But before we do that, if you could do me a favor, if you could hit that like button, subscribe, and the notification bell, and share. So don't forget to do all that for me. Like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification bell. I really, really would appreciate it. That like button is very important to us content creators. That helps push this information out to those who are most interested in the NFL draft, and to be all things sports related. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can watch and get notified of every episode of the Draft Beard podcast. And if you want to know immediately when I do air an episode, that's the notification bell. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I know all you guys out there probably get really sick and tired of every podcaster or content creator saying that, but it really is that important to us if you like our material. So thank you guys so much for doing that in advance. So tonight we are going to recap the AFC North. And so as I do that, I just wanted to fill you in if you haven't watched any of my other videos that I've been recapping. So you'll see a graphic on there that is team centric with each team's draft picks on there. I show you my Draft Beard big board, and I also show you the consensus big board on there. That way you can see right on the screen. If you're watching on video on YouTube, you can see where that player ranked versus the value either on my big board or the consensus big board. Can you kind of see, was that player a reach? Did they get really good value? And so that's just an overview there. You'll also see some spots where you'll see some players and their ranked value on the big boards will be in red. And that's just letting you know that they were not on a draftable grade, or basically they were ranked beyond the 257 picks that were in this year's NFL draft. If you see it bolded and red, that was on the consensus big board where there was beyond the 480 players that I saw that they had ranked. My little recap there. So when you see my chart on the screen, that kind of gives you an overview of that. So we are going to get started tonight with the Cincinnati Bengals. And so the Cincinnati Bengals, they ended up having, I believe it was 6 picks. So kind of a lighter class this year. And they started off with 17th overall, drafting Shamar Stewart out of the University of Texas A&M. I really liked Shamar. I understand some of the issues with him. Kind of be a polarizing prospect going into this year's draft. He was my last first-round graded player. I think I had 16 first-round grades on players this year. So not a great class, not a very deep class. But I like Shamar a lot. I think he is a player that at worst can be a good defensive end number 2, can set the edge, get you some pressures, push the pocket. If he can develop how to finish, become a better tackler, he has all the athleticism that you want as a defensive end. His defensive measurables are compared to some of the elites that you see in the game. I think it's a player that I would have liked here, maybe mid to late first round, I think is the sweet spot for him. I think taking him in the top 10 would definitely be a risk. 16, 17, right where the Bengals got him, is probably where I would have started to consider Shamar. I had him as number 16 on my draft board. Obviously, he went 17th overall. The consensus had him 18. So he got picked kind of right there where he probably should have went based on both of those rankings. In my mocks, I had the Bengals leaning a little bit more towards the interior of the defensive line, or maybe a cornerback there if Will Johnson fell. But the medicals obviously were a concern, and he fell much farther than that, so that wasn't really a consideration. I really thought interior defensive line is probably where they were going to go. And Kenneth Grant went just before him. Walter Nolan went. So the best player remaining on their board probably was Shamar Stewart. If you look at where other players were picked just after, maybe a Jihad Barron could have been there. Derek Harmon might have been a good consideration there. Interior offensive line could have been I think that might have been a little bit of a reach for a Donovan Jackson, a Gray Zabel. A player I really would have liked there is Malachi Starks. He was much higher on my draft board, but kind of nitpicking there. So getting a player that you really need to get some pass rush. I like Shamar Stewart. Maybe slightly would have went with a different player there. But again, the board didn't fall right for the Cincinnati Bengals. So you go into the second round at 49 overall. They picked Demetrius Knight, the linebacker out of the University of South Carolina. He was my fourth rated linebacker in this class. I had him 66 overall. The consensus had him 81. So I viewed him just a little bit higher. I think he's going to be a guy who could maybe be a starter, a good downhill linebacker. Cincinnati, I think, needs that type of linebacker for their defensive scheme. I look at other players in that position that were drafted there. I think they really needed some help on the offensive line. I would have rather seen them go at that point, go for the Tate Ratledge at that point instead of going for the linebacker. I know they need some linebackers on their roster. I think Demetrius Lake can be just a starter. I don't see him as having a high ceiling, more of a kind of a low floor, low ceiling type of player. He's a little bit older of a prospect. And then when you come back in the third round, they grabbed Dylan Fairchild, the guard out of the University of Georgia. I had him at 131 on my board. The consensus had him at 146. So not great value there. Definitely, according to both my and the consensus boards, that was definitely a little bit of a reach there. Not that I don't like Dylan Fairchild, but if you look at the process of how this draft could have played out, you could have ended up with, grabbing a Tate Ratledge there in the second round, and then you come back into the third round and maybe you grab a Kevin Winston Jr., grab a safety sitting there. You had a couple corners that could be of use to the roster, Jacob Parrish, Noel Williams sitting there. I know they needed a linebacker. Could have maybe went with another edge rusher and Josiah Stewart. I just think they could have played that a little bit better, got the better offensive lineman and went in a different position in the draft instead of the way they did it. Considering that I think Fairchild is a reach, I think he does have potential. I just think he's a low ceiling, higher floor prospect, going to need some time to develop. Then you come back in the fourth round at pick 119 and they go with Barrett Carter. He's going to be more of your coverage linebacker. So I see him being more of not a everyday 3-down linebacker, more of a situational pass defending linebacker. I think he's got some good athleticism to his game. Not that I didn't like him. He's just kind of a more of a freaky athlete who's going to need some work, some development to his game. So again, kind of like a just a guy kind of player. I know that they needed some linebackers. You now grabbed 2 of them here. And then you come back, you grab Jalen Rivers, the guard out of the University of Miami. Not a bad pick. So now you've doubled down on the offensive lineman. I think he's a developmental player. So if I go to my guard rankings over here, I had Rivers rated as a 4th round grade. He was my number 11 rated guard, right behind Dylan Fairchild. So I think there's some value there. He was picked 11 spots where I had him, picked just beyond or just right around where the consensus had him at 149. So I think it's a pretty decent pick, doubling down on guard there. Again, probably would have rather seen them go with the Ratledge and then also have Rivers. Instead, now you have 2 guys that are kind of low ceiling, maybe low floor, high ceiling players. So you got, you're taking a risk on maybe one of those hitting, but it's a little bit more of the roll of the dice. Then you come back in the 6th round at pick 193, get an absolute value in Taj Brooks out of Texas Tech. You'll see a lot in this year's draft that the running back class was stacked and teams didn't grab them early. It was a little bit like the quarterback, right? So if a team viewed them as like a starter or maybe to develop into a workhorse back, those guys kind of got picked early. And then it pushed a lot of the other running backs down the draft board. I had Taj Brooks as my number 13 overall running back. 4th round grade. And again, there were a lot of running backs in this class. I had almost 20 running backs with either 4th round or late 4th, early 5th round grades. So I think getting Taj Brooks there, phenomenal value. Overall, looking at the class as a whole, I gave the Bengals a C grade. I liked the Shamar Stewart pick. I just thought that a lot of the players that they got were kind of just a guys, maybe, your equal war type players, using that baseball analogy, and Knight and Bear Carter. I think that they can at least see the field this year. I think you came away with probably 2 starters and a running back there who will see some carries. And then I don't know if Fairchild and Rivers will be starters this season. Hopefully they can develop into something like that. But it was an okay class. I mean, they did draft, if you look at the board, right around where the player should have been picked. Only the Dylan Fairchild one is the reach, and that's my big nitpick with this draft. And then so you have the risk with Shamar Stewart. I think it's worth taking. But overall, I gave the Cincinnati Bengals a C grade in this draft. Also, they just didn't have a lot of picks as well to kind of bolster that up. So my favorite pick was Shamar Stewart. He was my favorite pick that the Bengals had. I think it's worth the risk there to take Shamar. I really think that he can develop. I think a lot of what you watch on film, it does show up. And I know the production isn't there, but he does push the pocket quite a bit, causing the quarterback to have to move, scramble, be off of his throw. So I like that pick. I think that was my favorite pick. My value pick, highest value there is Taj Brooks, the running back out of Texas Tech. And then obviously my most puzzling pick was the Fairchild pick there. I would have rather had them gone a different direction, maybe go Ratledge earlier, and that sets you up for maybe taking a Jamari Caldwell or something else, trading around, getting a Makuba. So that's where I had him. And again, that was a solid C grade for the Cincinnati Bengals. And so now we are going to move on to the next team I want to discuss in the AFC, and that is the Cleveland Browns. So the Browns had a very, very interesting draft, right? So we got started with the NFL draft, and things just went crazy right from the get-go. About 15 minutes, 30 minutes before the draft, you heard all the rumors that the Jags were looking to move up. As soon as the Browns got on the clock, you saw the trade happen. So the Browns moved down the draft board a couple of spots. They pick up a first-round pick next year, but you're passing on a generational talent. And so you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to pass on what could be a generational talent? I do go back and forth on the philosophy here, because you get exceptional value and getting a first round pick next year from the Jags, right? Who knows where the Jags will finish? Where will they be a team with Trevor Lawrence and then some of the new offensive players? Will they, be a team that makes it into the playoffs? So that pick next year be in the 20s, in the teens? Again, it could also be a pick that maybe reaches into the top 10, top 5, again, depending on how things develop in Jacksonville. So I think the value is there. We're going to look down the road and see, okay, did Travis Hunter develop into the premium player that we think he can be? Football's version of Shohei Ohtani. If that happens, in order to kind of compensate and make this look equal, Cleveland's going to have to come up with some generational or franchise-altering players out of this, right? So I think that what you're looking for is they set themselves up to possibly be in the quarterback race next year, right? Having the draft capital to do that. And so what they did is they've given themselves a really good player in Mason Graham. Now, I know Mason Graham, I think people got prospect fatigue getting Mason Graham or talking about Mason Graham before the draft, right? So they get him at number 5 overall. I love Mason Graham. I think he's a super high floor player. And if he develops into a pass rush, he can be a premium interior defensive tackle on the NFL. Obviously, being from Michigan and a Michigan fan, I've watched him a lot. I had him ranked in my top 3 on my big board that never wavered for me, even after seeing all the testing come out. I just watched him on film, and I think he can be a player. You can plug him in right away. He's going to be productive. And if he doesn't develop, okay, you got yourself an average to above average starter at the NFL level who's going to be really good at run defense with some pass rush ability. But if he develops even more on top of that, like I said, you're getting a premium player. I considered him one of the blue chip prospects of this draft. So you did trade away Travis Hunter. You did pick up a guy who I think can be a premium player for you, especially now that you're going to put him on the same defensive line with one of the great defensive ends in the game in Myles Garrett. You have a great defensive coordinator. I like the pick of Mason Graham. Where am I on my opinion on, well, what have I done it? Should have they done it? About 50-50. I kind of been split down the middle. I know that's not what you're supposed to do when you're talking. You need to have your hot takes, but I don't think this is going to be one of those where I have that hot take in this situation. I think it was good value. Set yourself up for the future, and you still got a premium talent at number 5 overall. Then we come back in the second round at pick number 33. And they end up going with Carson Schweshinger, the linebacker out of UCLA. He's a fun player to watch. I just think it's early for Carson Schweshinger. I had him at 61 on my draft board. I can see why teams in the NFL would just be tantalized with what they saw on film. He's just everywhere, all over the field. But yet at the same time, you also saw him not being able to get around blocks, get knocked down. The physical play strength wasn't as there as what I would have hoped, right? And so he's fun. Is that the player I would have taken there? Probably not. I think there were other players that might have fit a little bit better. Cleveland, had needs at corner. Obviously, we all know about the quarterback, maybe another additional edge player, a wide receiver. So probably a different position is what I would have preferred there, but I get it. I like the player. I think it's going to be fun to watch, pairing him on the linebacker position with JOK there. And then they come back again in the second round and they pick Quinshawn Judkins. Now, I wasn't as high on Judkins as others. I had him at 65 on my draft board. In my running back class, I had Quinshawn as my 8th overall running back. But I get it. Everyone's going to have a different opinion, a different flavor. I think that was a pretty decent pick. Might have went in a different route there. I might have grabbed a Travion Henderson there and then gotten one of the guys later in the draft because there was a lot of those type of players who could be, your every down, maybe short yardage type back, not your home run hitter. I think I would have done that reverse. I would have gotten Travion Henderson and maybe one of those home run hitters. But in the end, it kind of did work out for Cleveland. The draft fell well for them and being able to pick up 2 running backs, which we'll get to in just a second. So they ended up going running back there, and then Carson Schweshinger. Not great value compared to where I had the players on the big board. So I would have liked a different position there at linebacker instead of linebacker with Carson Schweshinger. Then you come back in the third round, you grab Harold Fannin. I had him 67 on my draft board, and he got drafted right at 67. Consensus had him at 69. Again, a pick right there with value. He's a polarizing prospect again. I think Harold can really just be a big wide receiver. I think that it's a pick that can pair well with who they have at tight end and David Njoku. I think it's going to work. I think you got a good offensive mind who can utilize Harold Fannin's abilities. I think that was pretty good value there. Again, they needed either a wide receiver. I think what you're getting is a big tight end, big slot, big guy that you can move all over, maybe throw him out at X, have him play all over, maybe sometimes come out of inline or H-back. So I liked that pick. I did want them to maybe bolster up the receiving end on their roster. Come back in the third round at pick 94. Now, I know a lot of people are going to hammer this pick as a reach. Now, I love Dillon Gabriel. Now, let me preface that. I love Dillon Gabriel in the context of this class. So I view this quarterback class as one guy who could possibly be a franchise quarterback and another a group of players that maybe one of these guys can just happen to be a starter at the NFL level. And I looked at Dillon and said, hey, if I'm going to bet on any of these guys post behind Ward, behind Shador, which we'll get to in a minute, I'm going to bet on Dillon Gabriel being that Brock Purdy type that just it works for him. Does he have the greatest NFL arm strength? No. Can he move around the pocket? Yes. Is he vastly undersized? Absolutely. 100%. However, I look at him as a guy that has some intangibles He's super smart, can read defenses well. I think he can be a functional backup at the NFL level with the potential to being an average NFL starter. And one thing that is very, very important when you look at quarterbacks, and that is, can they read defenses? Can they analyze? I think Dylan is one of the best in the class at this. And I think he's got just enough NFL arm strength where he can be a good NFL quarterback. Not great. Would I be also surprised if 3 years from now he's not in the league? Sure. But I think that's pretty much what you can say with almost every single quarterback outside of Cam Ward, and maybe even a little bit with Cam Ward. Would I be surprised if any of these guys are out of the league in 2 to 3, 4 years? Nope. But would I be shocked if we had a bunch of backups who are capable average starters in the NFL? No, wouldn't be surprised either. It's just an average to not great quarterback class. If I was going to take a risk on one, I had Dylan Gabriel as my 3rd overall quarterback. Yes, you heard that right. I had him as my number 3rd overall quarterback. And I think it's his ability to move around in the pocket. He's just athletic enough, but it is his smarts that I think can have him excel at the NFL game. So I didn't mind that pick, right? Come back in the 4th round and you pick up Dylan Sampson. So it ended up working out for them. They get tremendous value. I had Dylan at 60 on my big board. He goes 126. So now you do get that kind of maybe that every down back there to pair with the speedster and Dylan Sampson, who I think can be an absolute steal and a home run pick here if he can make sure he learns to hang on to the ball. So then you come into the 5th round at pick 144, and then that's where the slide finally stops and you get Shedeur Sanders at quarterback. Now, where I'm going to kind of ding the Browns here a little bit is if you wanted Shedeur, just take him earlier and get yourself one quarterback. You started this draft setting yourself up for next year and maybe being able to get a quarterback. And instead this year, you drafted 2 quarterbacks. So now when you look at it, the context, even though I like Dylan Gabriel, it probably would have been better process to take Shedeur, just be done with it, take him in the 3rd round or late or early in the 4th round and go for one quarterback. Or if you already took another one. So now you've had 2. You could have not taken Dylan Gabriel there, got yourselves in another position that can make a little bit more impact, drafted Shedeur Sanders later. I think that would have been a better use of assets and process. But now you've got 2 quarterbacks on your roster. You've log jammed yourself, and yet are you really going to give yourself the time to see if any one of these quarterbacks is going to develop? No, probably not. Because if you have not a good season and you're up in the top 3 again, or you got multiple picks and you have enough ammo to move up, more than likely, if there's a franchise quarterback that's there next year, you're going to move up anyway, get that quarterback, and then you've kind of wasted both of those quarterback picks, or maybe just one of them. Maybe you'll keep one around as a backup. So I don't think it's good use of process by the Cleveland Browns here. I'm probably pretty sure, and I know I'm speculating, the Shedeur pick probably came down from on high in the ownership, and you come away with 2 quarterbacks, but not exactly where I would have gone with that, considering we all know why they made the Travis Hunter trade. And that kind of, what are you going to do next year? If let's say Dylan or Shedeur lights it on fire this year, they look like, hey, maybe you've got something, maybe you could have a quarterback. Are you going to pass on a quarterback next year? Who knows? It's an interesting dilemma that the Browns are in. And so my favorite pick in this draft for the Cleveland Browns was, again, Mason Graham. I absolutely love that pick. I love the Dylan Sampson. That is the best value that I saw that they got in this draft. And then there's a couple puzzling moves, obviously, with the Shedeur and drafting Dylan Gabriel. Probably my most puzzling pick is probably that Carson Schwarzenegger pick. That's one where I'm just like, not one I would have made there. Overall, I gave the Cleveland Browns, I gave them a solid B grade. I think they got some really good players. They set themselves up in the future. But at the same time, was it a great use of resources and draft picks this year to come away with 2 quarterbacks when you know you're probably coming into next year looking to grab another quarterback? So overall, gave them a solid B. They're going to come away with some good players. They're going to have really good You're going to get a lot of good play this year from their running backs. I think you're going to see Harold Finn give you some production. I think Carson, you're going to see him on the field. Hopefully he can produce right away. We'll see. So I think it's a solid B. You got some starters in there, but you also took some risk. Well, and that takes us to our next team on the list, and that's going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so the Pittsburgh Steelers came away with, I believe, 7 picks in the 2025 NFL Draft. They got started at pick number 21 in round 1, and they went for the athletic defensive lineman, Derek Harmon out of Oregon. And that was the first sign here that we're going to might possibly see the Shedeur Sanders fall. I like the pick of Derek Harmon. I was a big fan of his. I had him number 20 on my board. Consensus had him at 28. He's a really good pass rusher. I think he has tremendous upside. He excelled very well transferring from Michigan State over to the University of Oregon. He was one of my favorite players in this draft. Overall, my defensive tackles, I had him as my 3rd rated defensive tackle behind Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. So I think that was a great pick by the Pittsburgh Steelers, just a typical Pittsburgh Steelers pick. Great value. I think he's going to fit really well with what they run in Pittsburgh. So that was a really good pick. They didn't have a 2nd round pick because they traded that away for DK Metcalf. And then the 3rd round, they came in and grabbed Caleb Johnson, the running back. I think that is just going to be a very typical Pittsburgh Steelers pick. I think that fits perfectly for what they're going to try to do. Now, I wasn't as high on Caleb Johnson. I had him ranked in the 80s, right? But I had him at number 9, I believe. He was my number 9 overall running back. Yeah, I had him right behind Quinshad Junkins. So, but he just fits. And sometimes when you're looking at draft classes and where they fall and where players go, and when you're given your draft grades, you got to look at team fit. And a lot of where players go and why they're successful is because they went to the right team, the right scheme. And I think he's a perfect Najee Harris replacement. He's a guy who, hey, you can use him for the 4 years. Don't sign him. I think he's going to be a guy who can be maybe your every down running back. Great pairing with Jaylen Warren. Really good floor. I think it's a good pick for Pittsburgh. They needed another running back to pair with Warren, and I think he's going to fit nicely. Again, solid pick by Pittsburgh. So the first 2 picks turned out to be pretty good, right there at value, right where they should be. I know the consensus was a little bit higher than Caleb Johnson. Then they come back around into the 4th round at 123 overall. And if you look at the player and where I had him ranked on my board and at 63, and it's Jack Sawyer, the edge, I just question, where is he going to fit? I know that they've done this in the past where they've selected non-athletic, kind of run-stopping, kind of more stiff, not agile defensive edges or linebackers and made them successful in their system. So Pittsburgh has done this before. I just got to question Jack Sawyer. He's not very athletic. I just don't see the fit and how he fits there. He's not a 3-4 defensive end. He's not a stand-up 3-4 outside linebacker. It's a weird pick. It's a weird fit for me. Didn't like that pick at all. I like the player in terms of the value. It's just it's not the scheme I would see Jack Sawyer succeeding in. Does he fit the mentality of Pittsburgh? Absolutely. Does he fit what they're looking for in terms of the type of demeanor and play style on the field? Sure. I completely understand that. I could see that. I just don't know schematically where he's going to fit. Probably not a player I would have liked to have seen go to Pittsburgh in round 4. I would have, maybe went in a different direction there. If you look at who got drafted around that spot, would have a Baron Sorrell fit better? Maybe he could have, with his size, played a little bit better, or a Kyle Kennard. You can debate that. Could have they went wide receiver there? A speedier Jalen Lane who went just beyond there. I could have seen a Malachi Moore might have fit well. The safety that the New York Jets took, he was one of my favorite guys there. You had some good receivers in Jalen Royals, Manor. But again, you're not going to go with those two with what you already had. So a speedy guy like a Jalen Lane or maybe a Jordan Watkins, I just didn't like that Jack Sawyer pick at all. It's just not a great schematic fit for me. You come back with Yaya Black. I think this is a reach. I had him at 204 on my big board. Consensus did not have him ranked. He's kind of he's an enormous nose tackle. He's got a lot of length. He's 6'6", big, weighty, 336 pounds. He's going to be a really good stuffing nose tackle. So, I think if you're just looking for a space eater, a just a guy space eater, that's probably him. In the 6th round, they come back with Will Howard. I had him at 218 in my board. Not a big Will Howard fan. I don't really see, the upside potential with them. I think he's kind of just a guy quarterback. Could be wrong. I just don't see it with Will. Does he fit the mentality that that Pittsburgh wants to see in their players? Yeah, he does, right? But I just don't see the great accuracy with Will Howard. I didn't see it in college. I think he's kind of one of those guys that's going to need a really good team around him, and maybe he can be a good couple week starter for you, provide good leadership in the locker room. And then they came back with two guys here in the 7th round at 226 and 229, both guys who I didn't have ranked. I didn't really get a lot of Carson Bruner, the linebacker out of Washington, so I really can't comment on that one. He's not a guy I really had much scouting report or much information on. Deontay Kent out of Central Michigan, know him a little bit. You're taking a stab in the 7th round. He's shorter at 5'11", 195. He just doesn't have great ball skills. So, they took a flyer out there, maybe guys who can contribute on special teams. But, my favorite pick here was Derek Harmon. I think the best value for the Steelers in terms of where they were on the draft board was Jack Sawyer, but he's also my most puzzling pick, right? I would have rather seen a David Walker, but they just missed him, right? Walker went in front of him. Sometimes you just got to trade up for the player that you can get, but Pittsburgh didn't have a lot of draft capital to work with. But loved the Derek Harmon pick. Again, not a fan of the Jack Sawyer pick. I gave the Steelers a B- grade. Really good 1st round pick. Filled a hole with their 3rd round pick, their 2nd overall. They didn't come away with a much better quarterback prospect. But then again, hey, maybe they didn't see something they wanted in Shedeur Sanders. So overall, I gave them a B-. You're going to come away with 2 starters in Johnson and Harmon for sure. And then a lot of other guys on the back of the class that maybe they can develop into, adequate special teams, rotational run stuffer, and then that questionable pick there with Jack Sawyer. So a solid B- for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Next up, we're going to move over to Baltimore and talk about the Ravens and what they do and do well, and that is draft. And so they are one of those teams that they let the draft board kind of fall to them, work their magic, and they had a stellar draft. They opened it up at 27th overall, getting Malachi Starks, who I had ranked 8 in my big board. He was a top 10 player for me. I think he is just the perfect pick for what the Baltimore Ravens do, what they want to run. He's going to pair well with Kyle Hamilton. That's going to allow Baltimore to move Kyle Hamilton all over the field, use him more as a chess piece. I like Malachi Starks is just a premier football player. And what I mean by that is he just is so instinctive and so smart. Is he the most athletically tested cornerback? No, he's not. But his play speed on the field is good enough. It's adequate. He has very good football IQ, and I think that's going to play well, especially with the Baltimore Ravens. That was a phenomenal pick there, getting one of the top 10 players, in my opinion, in this draft at number 27 overall. That's a home run pick. You come back in round 2, and now for the football player, this is a fabulous pick, but he fell for a reason. I have Mike Green. It was my number 6 overall player in this draft. He is a really, really good pass rusher. I think he's a better run defender than people give him credit for. However, there were some off the field concerns with Mike Green, whether that was, those 2 sexual assault issues that he had in college. Maybe there was some other stuff there. I know a lot of teams did have him off his draft board. I didn't adjust my big board for that. It's kind of hard to tell what's happening out there before the draft, what's rumor, what's real, what's speculation. But what I did kind of suspect that Mike Green would fall when you heard that only 2 teams had top 30 or 30 visits with Mike Green, and even those weren't even confirmed. So it kind of told me right away what the league was feeling about Mike Green. I didn't expect him to fall into the 2nd round. And of course, the Baltimore Ravens nab him. You can debate what that says, and with some of the other issues that other players on that team have had recently or in the past. You can nitpick Baltimore for that, but as a player on the field, he could develop into a premier all-pro type player. That's why I have him so high in my big board. Consensus had him 20. I had him 6 as exceptional value in the 2nd round. When you come back in the 3rd round at pick 91 overall, and you pick Emory Jones Jr., the tackle out of LSU. Now, this is one of those picks that I wasn't a fan of. I just was not as high on Emory Jones. In fact, if you look at where I had him as my 218th player on my big board. If you go to my tackle ratings, I had Emory Jones as a 6th round grade. I had him behind guys like Jalen Travis, Cameron Williams, Anthony Belton. Obviously, Belton went in the 2nd round, but wasn't as high on Emory Jones. I think he's a little bit more of a lower floor player than maybe other people, especially the Ravens here had him. I think, going in another direction, if he wanted to tackle, would have preferred that. I don't know. I just didn't get that pick at all. So not great value with Emory Jones. I know the consensus big board was much higher on him at 103. If you look at the consensus big board, it's great value. And then they come back in the next round and get Teddy Buchanan, who is an athlete playing at linebacker in the 4th round. I was a little higher than the consensus. I had him at 183. Consensus big board had him at 251. Again, maybe one of those players that was a little bit of a reach for me. I had him as a 5th round grade. I had him behind players like, Nick Martin, Jack Kaiser, Sammy Amondon. I probably would have liked to see them go maybe in a different direction there, but the Ravens do a really good job at finding players that they like, that fit what they're looking for. So then you come back, you got your 5th round pick at 141, and you get a bunch of picks here. They go for another tackle, one of those guys, a developmental tackle on Carson Vincent, guy who I had a later round, 223 on my big board, so a little bit of a reach. Then you come back in the 6th round at pick 178, and they pick up Belial Cohn, the cornerback out of the University of Western Michigan, a little taller at 6'1". I think they might have something there. He's just, he's really smart, right? I think he obviously needs some refinement. I had him at 206 on my big board. I kind of moved him up a little bit as the process went on. Consensus had him at 205, so we were right there. He's one of those guys who gonna contribute right away on special teams. He could be one of those sneaky players who, down the road you see him fill in, get some starts for Baltimore. They take the kicker and Tyler Loop out of Arizona. Special teams players being drafted, 6th, 7th round is probably where you want to start to look at doing those. Any earlier than that, I think that's just not great value and use of your assets. Another 6th round pick, an absolute steal in Aeneas Peebles. I had him at 103 on my draft board. He went 107 picks later at pick 210. Fabulous pick. I think this kid could be a starter at the NFL level. I know he's a little bit undersized. in terms of height, and do you play him inside or outside? So it's a little heavy maybe to be an edge rusher, but he's got a high motor. Love that pick. That is a phenomenal pick. If you switch some of these picks around, you told me that you came away with Aeneas Peebles at 129, or you picked him at 91, wouldn't have batted an eye. You get him at 210 overall. Fabulous pick by the Baltimore Ravens. Then you get another cornerback here, and Roger Langerbeam out of the University of Rutgers, 5'11", 175. He's going to be a nickelback at the NFL level. You're seeing more and more of a role for nickels. In fact, in this draft, a lot of guys who I had higher down my draft board went higher than I anticipated. I think the league is starting to prioritize nickelbacks more. So I think Langerbeam there could develop into a nickel corner at the NFL level. Either way, you've got a decent special team player. I think Garrett Dellinger, the guard out of LSU, a guy who maybe you can develop. He's got really good strength, 6'4", 325 pounds, decent in the run game, a developmental guard there. They do well with, finding players like that. So the top end of the draft, they got absolute killer, exceptional value. The back end of the draft, I think they got some reaches there, and then great value with Aeneas Peebles. My favorite pick for the Baltimore Ravens was obviously Malachi Starks. That's a steal. What a pick by the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens and Eagles just do it every year. They got great value again with Mike Green, tremendous value with Aeneas Peebles. And then, you did in the middle of the draft there, for me, it's some puzzling picks with Teddy Buchanan, Emory Jones. So overall, I think this is a really good draft by the Baltimore Ravens. I did give them an A because the top end of that draft is just so stellar. Getting 2 of the top 10 players on my board in the first and second round, didn't have to use any draft capital to move up to go get those type of players, letting the board fall to them. Fantastic value. I think a lot of the middle of the draft is a little bit of reaches, but absolute stellar job by Baltimore. You're going to get 2 impact players right away, and then a lot of special teams guys on the roster and developmental players. And Baltimore's really good at finding those players and developing them. So overall, an A draft for the Baltimore Ravens. It's the middle of that draft that prevents them from having an A+ draft, but in terms of value, they got exceptional value in those first 2 rounds. Whenever you can come away with players of that sort of caliber in the draft, you're going to come away with a very high grade. So overall, I gave them an A grade, highest graded draft of anybody in the AFC North, one of my highest grades overall in the NFL draft, but not the top. We'll get to those in other episodes. So thank you guys so much for joining me. That is my AFC North recap. So looking forward to recapping some other divisions as the NFL draft is over and we're moving closer and closer to training camps and mini camps. So thank you guys so much for joining me and have a great night.
The Draft Beard Podcast.